Dr. Eric Moreau stared at the weight in front of him, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. His mind raced, refusing to accept the reality of the moment. There was no way. There couldn't be. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the lab's equipment. The team of researchers stood frozen in disbelief, eyes wide, locked onto the scene unfolding in front of them. It had started as a routine physics test, a simple experiment to measure human strength in response to newly designed resistance training. Nothing about it should have been special. Yet here they were, witnessing something they couldn't explain. In front of them, a man, just an ordinary person, an office worker named Jack, stood with his hands gripping a barbell that weighed more than twice his body weight. But Jack wasn't struggling, wasn't even breaking a sweat. His face was calm, focused, almost serene. Then, with a single motion, he lifted the barbell as if it were nothing more than a piece of paper. "What the hell?" Catherine, Dr. Moreau's colleague, muttered under her breath. She was the first to speak, and her voice was laced with disbelief. Dr. Moreau stepped forward, his mind racing. He hadn't seen anything like this in his entire career. Jack wasn't a trained athlete. He was just a guy who had volunteered for the test. This shouldn't be possible. "Put it down," Dr. Moreau ordered, his voice trembling. Jack didn't respond, his hand still firmly clutching the barbell, raising and lowering it with ease. The machine measuring the resistance clicked and whirred, struggling to keep up with the force Jack was generating. "I said, put it down," Moreau repeated, this time louder. Still nothing. Jack continued his effortless lifts, a blank expression on his face. Something inside Moreau snapped. He rushed to Jack's side and yanked the barbell out of his hands, but it was no use, the man was too strong. Even as Moreau struggled to pull the weight away, Jack held on with an unexplainable force, his grip ironclad, his body unyielding. The lab was frozen in a collective gasp as Dr. Moreau realized, this was no ordinary human feat. The laws of physics were being broken before their very eyes. Just as quickly as the scene had escalated, Jack released his hold on the barbell and stood there, blinking as though coming out of a daze. His expression was confused. "What happened?" he asked, his voice faint. Dr. Moreau's mind raced to process the data, but there was no way to reconcile what they just witnessed with everything he knew about human biology. He turned to his team, his voice barely a whisper, "We need to run more tests. We need to know how this happened." But deep down, Moreau knew, this wasn't something they could explain with science, at least not with the knowledge they had right now. What they had just witnessed wasn't a simple fluke. Something had happened. And it was bigger than all of them. The first part of the mystery had just been uncovered, but the real question was, what would they do with this newfound knowledge? And more importantly, what had they just unleashed? Dr. Moreau's mind whirred as he paced back and forth in his office. The data from the experiment was in, but nothing about it made sense. He glanced over the reports again, resistance readings, force measurements, muscle strain. It all pointed to the same thing. Jack, an ordinary office worker, had just defied the laws of human strength. There was no way a person could perform at that level of power without years of training. Yet Jack had done it effortlessly. The room around him felt suffocating, as if the weight of the unknown had settled into the very air. He rubbed his temples, trying to force some clarity into the chaos. He had spent his entire career studying human biology, trying to understand the limits of human physical potential. What had just happened had shattered everything he thought he knew. "Dr. Moreau?" Catherine's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, holding a tablet. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp with curiosity. "I think you need to see this." Moreau looked up from the data, his eyes scanning her face. "What is it?" She handed him the tablet. It displayed footage from the test, the moment when Jack had lifted the barbell, his expression blank, as if he didn't even realize the gravity of what he was doing. The footage from the resistance monitors showed a strange spike in the energy being exerted. But there was no corresponding strain in Jack's muscles. "This can't be right," Catherine muttered, pointing at the screen. "The readings are off the charts, but his muscles aren't reacting like they should. His body is showing no signs of stress, and yet he's lifting more than a trained bodybuilder could. How is that even possible?" Moreau leaned closer, his gaze narrowing. "We need to run more tests. There's got to be some explanation. There's no way a human body can do this." As the days passed, Moreau and his team delved deeper into the mystery. They ran countless tests, each more intricate than the last. They monitored Jack's heart rate, his oxygen levels, his neural activity. They studied his muscle fibers, his bone density, even his genetic makeup. But no matter what they looked at, the results were baffling. Tom, the lab assistant, was the first to suggest that perhaps there was something inside the body that they couldn't measure with conventional methods. "What if the power isn't coming from his muscles at all?" he asked. "What if it's something deeper? Something in his biology that we've missed? Something dormant?" That idea hung in the air, lingering like a shadow. Could there be an untapped source of human strength hidden within the human body? It wasn't a new idea. Ancient myths and legends had spoken of superhuman abilities, but science had always dismissed them as fantasies. Still, the data they had wasn't something they could ignore. As the team continued their investigations, the questions multiplied. They brought in more test subjects, hoping to replicate Jack's feats. The results were staggering. Some individuals, ordinary people, just like Jack, were able to lift incredible weights, bend metal with their bare hands, or run faster than should have been physically possible. Yet, unlike Olympic athletes or bodybuilders, their bodies showed no signs of the kind of training or conditioning that should have produced such results. "This is impossible," Catherine whispered one evening, her voice tinged with fear. "We're not just dealing with biology anymore. We're on the edge of something we can't explain. What if this goes beyond human nature?" Moreau rubbed his eyes. He wanted to believe that this could be explained scientifically, but the evidence was mounting against him. The strength was real. And it was growing stronger with each new test subject. It wasn't long before the team realized something even more disturbing. The power didn't just come with physical strength, it had a strange, unpredictable effect on the test subjects' minds. Those who experienced the increase in strength often spoke of heightened senses, a feeling of euphoria, and a strange sense of invincibility. It was as if the newfound power gave them not just physical strength, but mental clarity as well. But there was a cost. Some of the subjects began experiencing headaches, nausea, and feelings of anxiety after using their strength. Others even reported hallucinations. The side effects were troubling. And yet, despite the risks, the power was too tempting for the test subjects to ignore. They felt invincible, unstoppable. They felt like they were finally tapping into something greater than themselves. Moreau's obsession grew. He became fixated on the idea that the human body was capable of far more than anyone had ever believed. But as he dug deeper, the moral implications of their work began to weigh on him. What if they were opening a door that shouldn't be opened? What if this strength came at a cost greater than they could imagine? Still, Moreau couldn't stop. He had to know what was happening. He had to uncover the truth. But as the days turned into weeks, Moreau and his team found themselves walking a dangerous line. The more they tested, the more they realized that the power they had unlocked wasn't just a scientific breakthrough, it was something far more profound, something that could change humanity forever. And they were starting to wonder, if they kept going, would they be the ones to control it, or would it control them? The more Dr. Moreau and his team delved into the phenomenon, the more they realized that this wasn't simply a breakthrough in human biology, it was a Pandora's box that they had unwittingly opened. The tests had gone from being a scientific curiosity to something much more unsettling. What they had uncovered was far beyond their understanding, and yet the temptation to press forward was too great. Catherine had become the most vocal skeptic in the group. "This isn't right, Eric," she had said during their last meeting. "What if we're tampering with something we don't fully understand? The human body was never meant to be pushed this far." But Moreau wasn't listening. He was fixated on the idea of tapping into humanity's hidden potential. The possibilities were endless. What if they could harness this power to cure diseases, end world hunger, or provide the strength needed to combat natural disasters? His mind raced with the potential of this discovery. He could change the course of history. As the team continued their research, the side effects of the experiments became more pronounced. Test subjects were reporting strange dreams, feelings of intense euphoria followed by crippling depression, and most alarming of all, episodes of uncontrollable aggression. The power that had been unlocked within them seemed to come at a cost. Their emotional states were becoming erratic, and the strength itself seemed to be pushing them beyond the boundaries of what was safe. Dr. Moreau had noticed the shift in behavior as well. Jack, the original test subject, had become withdrawn and agitated. His once calm demeanor had given way to sudden bursts of anger. His strength was increasing with each test, but so was his instability. One evening, as Moreau watched Jack perform another lifting test, he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Jack wasn't just lifting weights anymore, he was breaking them. He bent metal bars in his hands like they were nothing more than twigs. His face contorted in a mix of pain and rage, and his muscles twitched with unnatural force. "Jack, stop!" Moreau called out, rushing toward him. But it was too late. Jack hurled a massive steel beam across the room, narrowly missing one of the assistants. The crash reverberated through the lab, and the room fell silent. "I can't control it anymore," Jack said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and frustration. It's inside me. I don't know what's happening, but I can't stop it." Moreau stood there, frozen. The power they had unlocked was no longer just a scientific marvel, it was becoming a threat. Jack was right. Something was changing inside him, something they couldn't control. The strength was no longer just a physical attribute, it was a force that was consuming him from the inside. But even as Dr. Moreau's mind raced with the realization of the danger they were facing, he couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. There was more to this than he had ever imagined. The human body was capable of things they had only dreamed of. And if they could figure out how to control it, they could change everything. Yet, as Jack's situation became more dire, Moreau was forced to confront the undeniable truth: the strength they had unlocked wasn't simply a blessing, it was a curse. And if they didn't find a way to control it, it could destroy everything they had worked for. As days passed, the team began to notice something even more disturbing. Other test subjects, people who had initially shown signs of incredible strength, began to experience the same side effects. Some had violent outbursts. Others became paranoid, seeing threats everywhere, even in the safety of the lab. It was as though the power they had unleashed was warping their minds, turning them into something darker. One night, Catherine came to Moreau with a theory that was as unsettling as it was terrifying. "I think it's not just the power that's affecting them," she said, her voice low. "I think it's something inside the brain, too. The emotional trigger, it's like it's rewiring them. The strength is amplifying their darkest impulses. It's as if they're becoming something other." Moreau's stomach turned at the thought. Could this strength be changing human nature? Could it be forcing people to tap into the darker parts of themselves that they had buried deep within? Was the power more than just a physical force? It was a doorway into the raw, untamed aspects of humanity? And if that were true, then what would happen when the entire world became aware of it? What if the strength they had unlocked could be used by anyone, for any purpose? That night, Moreau couldn't sleep. He paced back and forth in his office, the weight of their discovery pressing down on him. He had wanted to unlock the potential of humanity. But now, he was beginning to wonder if they had opened a door that should never have been opened. By the time the team reconvened, the mood in the lab had shifted from curiosity to unease. Moreau couldn't shake the image of Jack's face as he had hurled the steel beam across the room, the look of fear in his eyes, and the overwhelming power that had surged through him. It had been too much. Too unpredictable. And now, every test subject seemed to be affected by the same uncontrollable force. The strength was growing, but so was the instability. Jack had become a shell of himself, his eyes haunted by the power he no longer understood. He refused to leave his room, spending most of his time pacing, his hands trembling as if he couldn't get a grip on the overwhelming energy coursing through him. "He's becoming dangerous," Catherine said one morning, her voice thick with worry. "I'm not sure we can help him anymore." Moreau shook his head, unwilling to accept that conclusion. "We've come too far to stop now. We need to understand what's happening, why it's happening. This is the key. We can't let it go." But even as he spoke the words, a part of him knew that they might be past the point of no return. Days passed in a blur of testing and analysis. Moreau's team continued to monitor Jack's condition, but each day seemed to bring more disturbing signs. Jack's physical strength had reached new heights, he was now lifting objects that were far beyond the capabilities of any human being. But it wasn't just his strength that had changed. He was becoming erratic, his emotions swinging wildly between aggression and despair. One minute, he would be calm, almost peaceful, and the next, he would lash out at anyone who came near him. It was as if the power within him had taken on a life of its own, something that could not be controlled or contained. One evening, Moreau sat alone in his office, staring at the screen of his computer. The data from the last test was on the screen in front of him. There were new readings, more unexplained spikes, more strange anomalies. The strength they had unlocked wasn't just physical, it was spreading throughout the brain, altering the neural pathways. But the real problem wasn't the strength itself, it was the emotional instability that accompanied it. The power was magnifying their deepest fears and desires. What had once been an extraordinary gift had become a curse. Moreau sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of it all. The idea of harnessing this power for good had been his driving force, but now he was questioning everything. What if this strength wasn't meant to be controlled? What if humanity wasn't ready for it? As he pondered these thoughts, a loud crash from the testing room jolted him upright. His heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, he rushed out of his office and down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. He burst into the testing room to find Jack standing in the middle of the lab, his face contorted with rage, his body pulsing with unnatural energy. "Jack!" Moreau shouted, but the words barely registered. Jack was holding a massive metal support beam in his hands, his knuckles white with tension. He looked like a man on the verge of snapping. "I can't control it anymore." Jack screamed, his voice filled with desperation. I'm becoming something else. It's too much." Moreau stepped forward, trying to reach him. "Jack, listen to me. We can help you. You have to trust us. We'll figure this out." But Jack's eyes were wild, and there was no trace of the calm, collected man who had walked into the lab just weeks ago. The power had changed him. It had consumed him. And Moreau knew, deep down, that he might not be able to save him. Suddenly, Jack hurled the metal beam across the room with an impossible force. It crashed into the far wall, sending sparks flying. The team watched in horror as the lab seemed to tremble under the weight of his fury. Jack collapsed to his knees, his body racked with pain. Sweat poured down his face, and his breathing was labored. I can't stop it." Moreau stood frozen, staring at the broken man in front of him. The strength they had unleashed had become a weapon that was now turning on them. Later that night, Moreau found himself alone in his office, reviewing the data once more. The team had placed Jack under observation, but he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep him contained. The emotional volatility was only getting worse, and the other test subjects were beginning to show signs of the same instability. Some had started exhibiting symptoms of withdrawal, others had become hostile, and one had even tried to escape the facility. Moreau's thoughts raced. This wasn't just about the power anymore, it was about the consequences of unleashing something that had no clear boundaries, no limits. They were playing with fire, and they didn't know how to put it out. He sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. Was the pursuit of knowledge worth the price they were paying? Was it worth risking the very fabric of what made them human? His mind kept circling back to one thing: what if they weren't meant to know this? Moreau rubbed his eyes, realizing the truth. They had opened a door that shouldn't have been opened. And now, there was no way to close it. The days blurred together as Moreau and Catherine scrambled to find a solution. They threw themselves into the data, trying every theory, every potential method to reverse the effects of the experiments, but it felt like they were always one step behind. The more they worked, the more the power grew within the test subjects, particularly Jack. It was as if the strength had become a living thing, something that fed off their attempts to control it, only growing more uncontrollable in return. Jack's behavior continued to spiral. One morning, he vanished. The security footage showed him slipping past the guards with an eerie calm, his movements unnatural, fluid with the same otherworldly strength they had seen in the lab. He'd left a note behind, scribbled hastily on a piece of paper. "I can't stay here anymore. I can't keep fighting it. If I stay, I'll hurt everyone. I'm leaving. Don't try to find me." The note was a punch to Moreau's gut. He couldn't help but feel like he had failed Jack, even if the young man had made the decision on his own. He knew it was too dangerous for Jack to be out there. His strength, unchecked, was a threat not only to himself but to everyone around him. "We have to find him," Catherine insisted when Moreau showed her the note. "Before he hurts someone. Before it's too late." Moreau nodded, his mind racing. They had to stop Jack before the power consumed him completely. But what if it was already too late? What if Jack had already passed the point of no return, the point where nothing could save him? They mobilized quickly, gathering a small team to search for Jack. The lab was located on a remote research facility, far from civilization, but Jack had managed to escape in the dead of night. The team tracked his path through the woods surrounding the facility, but as they ventured deeper into the forest, they found no sign of him. The only trace they had was a series of broken trees and crushed branches, evidence of the raw force Jack was capable of. The further they went, the more the air felt heavy, oppressive. It was as if the forest itself had become a reflection of the tension within Moreau's heart. Every step they took felt like a step closer to disaster, but they had no choice. Jack had to be found, and they had to contain him. Hours passed, and the search team's morale began to wane. It seemed impossible that Jack could be out here on his own, moving through the wilderness with the strength of a god. Yet, as they pushed forward, Moreau couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just hunting Jack, they were hunting a ghost. The very power that had once made Jack extraordinary now made him a shadow, something uncatchable, untouchable. Then, as the sun began to set, casting a dim light over the forest, they found him. It was a clearing, a small patch of land bathed in golden light. Jack stood there, his back to them, staring out into the distance. His posture was unnaturally still, and for a moment, Moreau thought he might have imagined it. But then Jack turned, and the intensity in his eyes sent a chill down Moreau's spine. Jack's body had changed. His muscles were more defined, but they had become almost too large, too exaggerated. His face, once a picture of youthful energy, was now drawn with a sharpness that seemed almost inhuman. He wasn't just a man anymore, he was a walking embodiment of the strength they had unlocked, of the monster they had created. "Jack," Moreau called out cautiously, stepping forward. Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at the ground, his chest rising and falling with deep, ragged breaths. Moreau could see the conflict in his eyes, the remnants of the person Jack used to be, now buried beneath the monstrous strength that controlled him. "You don't have to do this," Moreau said softly, his voice pleading. "We can help you, Jack. We can stop this before it goes any further. Please." Jack's lips twitched, as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally, he looked up, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You don't understand. I don't even know who I am anymore. This strength, it's taking everything from me. I'm not human anymore, Eric. I'm a weapon. And you created me." Moreau took another step forward, ignoring the growing sense of danger that clawed at his instincts. "That's not true, Jack. You're still you. We just need to figure out how to bring you back. We can reverse the process. We can help you control it." But Jack shook his head violently. "It's too late for that. You can't fix me. You can't fix this." With a sudden, sharp movement, Jack's hand shot out, grabbing a nearby tree and effortlessly tearing it from the ground, roots and all. He held the massive tree like a twig, his face contorting with a mix of pain and rage. "Jack, no!" Moreau cried, taking another step forward, desperate to reach him. "Don't do this." But Jack's grip tightened on the tree, and without warning, he hurled it toward Moreau and his team. The force of the impact sent them diving for cover, the ground shaking as the tree crashed into the earth with a deafening roar. As Moreau lay on the ground, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, he knew that they had reached the breaking point. They had lost control, and Jack, once a young man with potential, was now a living weapon. The power they had unleashed had turned into something far more dangerous than they could ever have imagined. But there was still one thing Moreau knew for certain. If there was any hope of saving Jack, it wouldn't come from force. It would come from reaching him, the man behind the monster. He had to believe that the Jack he had known still existed somewhere inside. Moreau got to his feet, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "Jack, we can stop this together. Don't make me lose you." Jack stood frozen, his body tense, and for a brief moment, there was silence, a moment where both sides seemed to hold their breath. Would Jack listen? Or would the power consume him completely? And ripping it from the ground with terrifying ease. The trunk snapped in his grip like a twig, and he hurled it aside, sending it crashing through the trees. The raw power was undeniable, and the way Jack moved, effortless, fluid, was almost beyond belief. He stood there, chest heaving, his eyes flicking between the group, before he turned back to Moreau. "I'm not the person you knew anymore," Jack said, his voice low and strained. "I don't belong here. And neither do you." A wave of guilt washed over Moreau. He had been the one to push for the project to continue. He had been the one to ignore the warning signs, to convince everyone that they were on the brink of something amazing. But now, standing before the shattered remains of the tree, he realized how wrong he had been. They had awakened something that no one, least of all Jack, could control. "Jack," Moreau called, his voice shaking. "Please, listen to me. You're not just a weapon. You're a human being. We're going to help you. We'll find a way to fix this, but you have to trust me. You're not alone." Jack's gaze flickered to the group standing behind Moreau, their faces a mixture of fear and concern. He seemed to consider them for a moment, but then the look in his eyes hardened once again. "No," Jack said firmly. "You're not listening. I'm beyond help. I've already done things I can't take back. And the more I try to fight it, the stronger it gets. I can feel it eating me alive from the inside. This power is not a gift. It's a curse. The finality in Jack's voice hit Moreau like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to tell Jack that he was wrong, that they could still turn this around. But he knew, deep down, that Jack wasn't just speaking from fear. He was speaking from truth, a painful, undeniable truth. Jack took a few steps back, his hand clenching into a fist again, his muscles bulging with the strain. The ground beneath his feet cracked, unable to withstand the force he was exerting. For a moment, the entire forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for what would come next. "Jack, please," Catherine spoke up, her voice trembling. "Don't do this. You're still in there. We can help you, but you have to fight. Don't give up on yourself." For a second, there was a flicker of hesitation in Jack's eyes, as if the person he once was still there, somewhere deep inside. But then, that moment passed, and his expression became cold, distant. "No. I'm already gone," Jack said quietly. "And I won't let you drag the rest of you down with me." Before anyone could react, Jack turned and sprinted toward the edge of the clearing. His movements were so fast, so fluid, that it was almost like watching an animal in its prime, unstoppable, ruthless. He disappeared into the dense forest with a speed that left the group frozen in place, unable to follow. Moreau stood there for a long moment, the weight of Jack's words hanging in the air. The forest seemed to close in around them, the silence deafening. What had they created? What had they unleashed on the world? "We can't let him go," Catherine said, her voice shaking with both fear and resolve. "We have to stop him, Eric. Before it's too late." The decision to pursue Jack wasn't an easy one. They knew that Jack, with his newfound power, could be dangerous, more dangerous than any weapon humanity had ever created. But Moreau knew they had no choice. If they didn't act quickly, Jack would be beyond saving. He was already slipping away, and with each passing moment, the person he had been, the person they had hoped to save, was fading faster. Moreau and Catherine led a small team into the forest, but it was clear that the odds were stacked against them. Jack's speed was like nothing they had ever seen before. He was already miles ahead, and the trail he left was a wake of destruction. Trees were bent, rocks were shattered, and the ground seemed to shift under the force of his every step. It wasn't long before they found themselves at the edge of a cliff. Below them, a steep drop into a rushing river far below. And there, standing at the edge, was Jack. Moreau called out to him, his voice hoarse. "Jack, please. Don't do this. You're not a monster. You don't have to run. Come back with us." Jack turned to face them, his eyes empty and distant, his body trembling with the effort it took to contain the overwhelming power surging through him. "I told you, Eric," Jack said, his voice breaking. "I can't control it. And I don't know how much longer I can control myself. I can't hurt anyone else." For a moment, Moreau thought he saw a flicker of the Jack he had known, the Jack who had been a young man full of dreams and potential. But that spark was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something darker. Something broken. "I can't stop it," Jack repeated, almost to himself. "I've tried. I can't fight this anymore. I'm sorry." Without another word, Jack turned and stepped closer to the edge of the cliff. The wind picked up, howling through the trees as if trying to warn them of what was about to happen. Jack took one last look at Moreau and Catherine before he leapt. The sound of his body hitting the water below was deafening, a final, tragic note in the silence that followed. Moreau stood frozen, the world around him moving in slow motion as he processed what had just happened. Jack was gone. Catherine's voice broke the stillness, her words barely a whisper. "We couldn't save him." Moreau swallowed hard, his throat dry, his heart heavy with grief. They had failed. Jack had been a victim of their ambition, a casualty of their desire to push humanity beyond its limits. But now, with Jack lost, the weight of their actions, of their mistakes, was impossible to ignore. They couldn't save Jack. But Moreau vowed that no one else would suffer the same fate. He would find a way to stop the project, to prevent the power they had unlocked from destroying anyone else. If it was the last thing he did, he would make sure that humanity would never again be tempted to play with forces they could not control. And in the depths of that resolve, Moreau understood the true lesson that Jack had left behind: the strength of the human spirit is a gift, but unchecked power, no matter how pure the intention, can become a curse. For a moment, Moreau thought he saw a flicker of the Jack he had known, the boy who had dreamed of making the world a better place, who had once believed that science could solve everything. The same Jack who had been excited to start this project, who had trusted Moreau and Catherine when they had promised to change the world. But the moment passed as quickly as it came, and Jack's gaze hardened again, as if he had already made his peace with what was happening. The raw power within him was still there, a force so destructive that Moreau could feel the ground trembling beneath his feet. And yet, despite the overwhelming strength, Jack seemed like a broken man, fighting not only against his own power but against his very identity. "Jack," Moreau called out, stepping forward, trying one last time to reach him. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to destroy yourself. Please, let us help you." Jack's eyes flickered with pain, but he remained still, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "You don't get it," Jack said, his voice raw. "The more I try to fight it, the stronger it gets. It's too late. I'm not the person you knew anymore. I'm something else, something that doesn't belong in this world. I've already hurt so many people, and I can't take it back." The words hit Moreau like a gut punch. The reality of what they had created, of what Jack had become, crashed down on him with the force of a freight train. He had tried to make it right, tried to find a way to reverse the damage, but nothing worked. And now, Jack had made his decision. Moreau could feel the desperation creeping into his voice. "You're still you, Jack. I know you're scared, but I know who you are. You're not beyond saving. Please, don't walk away from us." Jack looked at him for a long moment, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker of something human in his eyes. But then the moment passed, and Jack took a step back, his foot edging closer to the cliff's edge. "I'm not the same person anymore, Eric," Jack said softly. "I can't let this power control me any longer. It's not just a burden, it's a curse. And I'm not going to let it hurt anyone else. I'm sorry." The pain in Jack's voice was almost more than Moreau could bear. The man before him wasn't just a test subject anymore. He wasn't just someone who had been caught in the middle of their experiment. He was a victim, someone who had lost everything in the pursuit of something they thought was good. But as Jack took another step toward the edge, something inside Moreau snapped. He had spent too many years of his life fighting for progress, for the belief that science could make things better, that humanity had the power to overcome any obstacle. He couldn't let that belief die here, not like this. Moreau stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Jack, please. Don't do this. You don't have to carry this alone." For the first time, Jack's expression softened, and the weight of the decision before him seemed to settle over him. He looked down at the edge of the cliff, the raging river below, and for a moment, Moreau thought he might jump. He couldn't let that happen. With a sudden, desperate movement, Moreau reached out, grabbing Jack's arm. "I don't care what you think you've become. You're still human. You're still a part of this world, and we can help you find your way back. Please, Jack. You don't have to end it like this." Jack hesitated. The tension in the air was palpable, each of them waiting for the other to make the next move. For a long, painful moment, the only sound was the wind whipping through the trees and the distant rush of the river below. Then, with a shuddering breath, Jack lowered his gaze. His hand, trembling, unclenched, and the raw energy that had been surging through his body seemed to subside, just for a moment. "Help me," Jack whispered, the words barely audible. Moreau's heart swelled with relief, but he knew they weren't out of the woods yet. They still had to get Jack back, still had to reverse the damage. But for the first time in days, Moreau felt like there was hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could save Jack after all. The journey back to the lab was slow and cautious. They couldn't afford to rush, not with Jack still struggling to maintain control. The team moved in silence, all of them aware that they were walking a razor's edge. One wrong move, one slip, and they could lose Jack to the power that had consumed him. Moreau stayed close to Jack, talking to him softly, encouraging him to take it one step at a time. The strength was still there, unmistakable, but Jack was fighting it now. And that was the first step toward redemption. When they finally reached the lab, Catherine was waiting, her face filled with both hope and fear. She knew the road ahead would be long, that the journey to undo what they had done wouldn't be easy. But in that moment, Moreau knew that they had a chance. They had saved Jack from the brink of destruction. And, more importantly, they had reminded him that he was still human. That he still mattered. Jack looked at Moreau, a faint but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You didn't give up on me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No one ever will," Moreau replied, his voice firm but filled with warmth.